We are live. So Toby Young, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
I am really excited to talk to you because ever since I was fired for my speech, I've kind of become consumed by the topic of free speech. And can you just start us off by giving us an overview of what is the Free Speech Union and how you came to be its founder?
So the Free Speech Union is a non-partisan membership organization that stands up for the speech rights of its members. It launched in February, and since then we've attracted more than 7,000 members. And we've had a number of successes in which we've come to the defense of people who've either been cancelled or targeted for cancellation, and in some cases managed to get them restored to jobs that they'd been fired from. In other cases, we've managed to kind of see off the cancellation mob that had targeted them. And we're sort of working across a number of other areas too. So we try and stop controversial speakers from being no-platformed by student activists at universities. We campaign to strengthen free speech policies at universities, or to prevent vice chancellors on resiling on those free speech policies they've already put in place. We campaign to change the law in England and Wales, and in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and we try and stop the law, at least as regards free speech, being made any more restrictive. And there are various efforts to do that in the United Kingdom. And it's been, I think, so successful that we now want to open a branch in the United States. And we're in the process of incorporating in the US, and hope to launch next year, fairly early next year. I mean, I think there's an even more urgent need for an organization like ours in the US than there is in the UK.
Yeah, I wonder about that actually. Can you speak a little bit to those differences? I think since I've become involved in this discussion, it was through the transgender topic, but it quickly became about free speech at its core. And I think in the UK, there's a much more robust discussion right now around free speech. I'm not sure exactly how much you are, keyed into the US discussion, but do you think we're completely lacking it here? It's kind of how I'm feeling.
I think we're facing many of the same issues. So, for instance, yesterday, one of the Free Speech Union's members, a teacher at Eton, which is probably the most famous school in the UK, if not the world, after Hogwarts. It's a real school. He was fired from his job as a teacher by the headmaster because he produced a video lecture in which he challenged some of the radical feminist orthodoxy that the boys at the school are typically taught on an almost daily basis. There's this great sort of concern by the fairly woke headmaster and his equally woke senior leadership team that these predominantly white boys from privileged backgrounds are prone to misogyny. And so it's their job to teach them, to sort of cleanse them of this sin. So they are, I mean, it's maybe a slight exaggeration to say it, but they are more or less bombarded night and day with kind of radical feminist orthodoxy. They have kind of male feminists come into the school to tell the boys that traditional masculinity is toxic, and that men traditionally have been complicit with the systemic oppression of women, and so on and so forth. They have this kind of anti-patriarchy ideology that they really try and instill in the boys, and there very much is an institutional view at the school, and if you dissent from that view, you can attract the ire of the headmaster and some teachers. And that's what happened in this case. So he made a video lecture, put it on the school intranet channel, and it was for a particular strand in the curriculum where the boys were encouraged to think critically and independently about big issues, big topics like sex and gender. And you're supposed to, in that strand, teachers are supposed to kind of take a polemical view, put forward a very one-sided argument, which is what he did. So it was a fairly robust critique of radical feminist orthodoxy. And a member of staff complained. And the complaint was that if a female member of staff is going to be asked to discuss the content of this lecture with boys in the school, that could be a degrading and humiliating experience for them. And that would constitute harassment under something called the 2010 Equality Act, which was an act of parliament passed by the last Labour government here 10 years ago. And it does prohibit various forms of harassment in the workplace. It's quite ambiguously drafted. And some people think that interpreting it in a way which would circumscribe what can be taught in a school curriculum is interpreting it in a particularly overcautious way, but nonetheless it can be interpreted in that way. And so the headmaster, when he received this complaint, took legal advice and concluded that yes, the school could be liable for a harassment suit if female members of staff, femaleness being a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, were expected to discuss the content of this lecture with boys. And so the headmaster, thought that he was legally obliged to, and I think probably wanted to anyway, prioritize the emotional safety of his staff over intellectually challenging the students and allowing the staff free range to teach them, what they wanted. And that same fight, that conflict between intellectual freedom and emotional safety is being played out, across the educational sector and in other institutions too, but particularly in the educational sector. He's a member of our organization. We went to bat for him. We didn't succeed in defending him. We didn't manage to get him his old job back. So now we're going to take various other courses of action. And one of the things we want to do is to try and get a friendly member of parliament to amend the Equality Act to clarify that it cannot be used to circumscribe the content of the school curriculum. And to give you a live example of where this might, where the rubber might hit the road, I know that in a lot of US high schools, To Kill a Mockingbird has been withdrawn from the curriculum, and in some cases withdrawn from school libraries on the grounds that it contains this sort of white savior narrative, which some minorities, some black and brown students might find offensive, that it might kind of undermine their sense of well-being, their sense of safety in the school, and so forth. And for that reason, it's been banned. But you can imagine some black or brown teachers saying in an English school, asking me to teach that book with its white savior narrative to my students is a degrading and humiliating experience, and would be a form of harassment. And if you insist on my doing that, I will take you to court and sue you. And if we do interpret the Equality Act as giving teachers that latitude, then I can see that book being banned from English schools, just as it has been from some schools in US states. So that we want to get the Equality Act amended if we can, to make sure it cannot be invoked in that way.
Yeah, that kind of brings us to the issue of whether open debate and dialogue can actually be an antidote to these things. I mean, as you mentioned, there's this desire for safety, safe spaces, and people don't want to be made to feel uncomfortable by words, but they're really just that, words, right? So can you talk a little bit about why words are being compared to violence and what that's doing, how they're using that to suppress speech and literature?
Yes, I mean it's I think it's a perversion of J.S. Mill's harm principle, whereby the only legitimate limits on what people can say are that they shouldn't be allowed to say things which could lead directly to harm. That's conventionally been understood as directly leading to physical harm. And I think that principle has been extended in two ways to restrict free speech. First of all, there's the claim not that someone saying something actually immediately and directly leads to harm, but that it could lead to harm. The argument often made by trans activists is that if you resist using the preferred pronouns, that could, in certain circumstances, lead to the suicide of a trans person. So for that reason, people should be compelled to use the preferred gender pronouns of people, because if they don't, it could lead to harm in that sense. It might not be very easy to show a kind of causal chain between someone refusing to use a trans person's preferred gender pronoun and the death of a trans person by suicide. But nonetheless, if that's plausible, if that's possible, if it could in a universe lead to someone committing suicide, then for that reason, people should be compelled to use preferred gender pronouns. So that's one way in which the harm principle has been perverted. But the other way is the way you mentioned, which is to describe a feeling of discomfort, of mental anxiety as itself a form of harm. So the mere act of someone finding something offensive could be itself a form of harm, a species of harm, which could justify you restricting someone from saying something. Why has that happened? I think it's partly because of the kind of therapeutic turn that Western societies have taken, in which there's been a kind of much greater concern about mental well-being, about trying to eliminate anxiety where possible, trying to preserve people's sense of emotional safety, and a sort of belief that the duty of care of institutions and employers extends to kind of doing everything they can to protect the mental well-being of their students and their employees. I think it's partly because of that sort of general trend. I think it's also, it's just a way for political activists to weaponize kind of therapy culture in order to limit what their political opponents are able to say. It's a way of just silencing the opposition. I think in that respect, insofar as it is motivated by that kind of, political interest, it's quite short-sighted, because once you grant various authorities the right to dictate what can and can't be said in universities, schools, workplaces, and you give up that right yourself. It's all very well when the authorities are politically aligned with you, but there's no guarantee they'll be politically aligned with you in perpetuity. And in due course, there might be, the wind might change, and you won't be able to fall back on your speech rights to protect yourself and to protect your right to say what you feel and to express your political views. So it does seem to me to be very short-sighted. I think Ira Glasser, the legendary ex-head of the ACLU, said that speech restrictions are a bit like poison gas. On the battlefield, when you have the enemy in your sights, releasing poison gas can seem like a good idea, but the wind can change and it can blow back in your face.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Ira Glasser, because the ACLU here now, we have an ACLU attorney who was promoting the suppression of a book of Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage recently on Twitter. I did want to ask you, do you draw limits at the Free Speech Union? What are your limits on speech that you don't support?
Yeah, well, we try and be pretty permissive, and probably as permissive as the ACLU was in its heyday. But we do have a statement of values on our website, and we do expect our members to subscribe to those values. And we do say that we reserve the right to kick people out if they engage in threats of violence, or they try and intimidate people they disagree with as a way of trying to silence them. So if they don't respect the speech rights of others and engage in underhand tactics to try and silence them, then we wouldn't certainly exclude them, but we would reserve the right in those circumstances to rescind their membership.
And is there a particular case that you've had to defend someone's speech rights where you really didn't agree with their speech, or you even found their speech detestable?
Yeah, well, there was a recent case actually of a former Labour Party politician called Chris Williamson, who was politically aligned with Jeremy Corbyn, and has on various occasions been accused of anti-Semitism. But to put those accusations in context, the reason he attracted those accusations is mainly because he defended people who had themselves been accused, people on the left, people in the Labour Party, been accused of anti-Semitism, and he disputed that they were guilty of it. So he hasn't, I don't think, said anything that itself has been designated as anti-Semitic, as far as I know, but he has defended people who've said things that have been described as anti-Semitic. And so he's been sort of tarred by association with those people he sought to defend, who he's sort of politically aligned with. And he was due to speak recently at the Royal Holloway University in London. And the Students' Union, the president of the Students' Union, decided that not that his being allowed to speak was a breach of their anti-hate speech policy, but that the student society that invited him to speak, and which is sort of authorized to do so by the Student Union, hadn't gone through the proper procedure to enable the Student Union to evaluate whether or not he breached that policy. It's a slightly weaselly way of trying to no platform someone, but the gist of it was he's defended anti-Semites, and that doing that constitutes hate speech under our definition of hate speech, and therefore he shouldn't be allowed to speak at our university. And so we went to bat for him. Now, politically, he's about as far from me as it's possible to be, and yet we nonetheless felt obliged to defend his right to free speech. So far, we haven't yet. We're involved in a protracted correspondence with the president of the university, but at least she is engaging with us and trying to defend the decision.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I really admire about the Free Speech Union, that you explicitly say that you do defend speech you don't agree with. And I mean, what is the importance of that to you? You did talk about the idea that it's a strategy. You can't suppress others' speech because it will come back to haunt you eventually. So could you speak a little bit to that, how it's a strategy to protect your own speech?
Yeah, well, I think that I believe that free speech benefits people of all political persuasions. Anyone who wants to speak their mind, say what they think in the public square, can only do so if their speech rights are protected. And protecting their speech rights shouldn't be contingent on their having particular points of view that you find acceptable or you happen to agree with. I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think one of the reasons that free speech has fallen from favor a little bit, one of the reasons that the current generation of students at universities across the Western world aren't as energetic about defending free speech as they might be, is that they've been persuaded that it's essentially a benefit that protects the privilege of kind of male, pale, and stale conservatives, and doesn't protect them. There's nothing in it for them. They don't benefit from it in any way. And that's very short-sighted. And again, to quote Ira Glasser, when asked this particular point, he said that had it not been for various landmark First Amendment victories won by the ACLU, the various civil rights organizers wouldn't have been able to organize, protest, march, and the civil rights movement really would have been stymied in its infancy had it not been for those protections of the First Amendment. And that's a good example, I think, of how free speech historically has, for the most part, benefited the disempowered, the disadvantaged, minorities, historically marginalized groups. It hasn't protected the privileged and the powerful. It's if you don't have free speech, who's going to decide what you can and can't say? It's going to be the privileged and the powerful. So if you restrict speech rights and transfer those powers to various authorities, you're going to entrench privilege and entrench centralized power. You're not going to advance the cause of social justice. I think that's a really important argument to make, particularly in universities and colleges. So students understand that it ain't just for people like me; it's also for them.
Yeah. And now I want to talk a little bit about the mob. So the mob mentality and the psychology behind the mob that we see on Twitter and in real life, but they dig through people's old tweets or their old posts or whatever it is. I just did an episode with a woman who criticized Black Lives Matter, and then she was absolutely destroyed. She lost her job for 20 years, death threats, rape threats to her daughters, couldn't get a new job, still hasn't. So why does this mob think that it's virtuous? And what is it getting out of this?
Yeah, well, I think I'm often asked why it is I think that free speech is under attack on multiple fronts. What's changed? What's happened to endanger it? And I think the answer is that it's not that the default position is that everyone's in favor of free speech. The default is the opposite. Human beings are naturally tribal and intolerant, and anyone who challenges the sacred values of a particular community, the kind of natural human impulse is to expel that person from their community or worse. So I think that's the natural human condition. That respecting people who disagree with you, defending the right of those who challenge the things you hold most sacred, to challenge them without suffering any sort of punishment. I think that's very unnatural and very unusual and historically anomalous. It's a very precious and fragile piece of civilization which can easily be taken away from us. And I think that's what we're witnessing. And I think it's social media has created a vehicle through which that atavistic, primordial intolerance can be expressed. And what happens, on a daily basis, particularly in Britain and across the Anglosphere, is that people who are perceived to be transgressors of the sacred values of the educated elite, of the kind of secular priesthood of our societies, people who are perceived as being transgressors of those sacred values are attacked with a kind of uninhibited ferocity, and there is no mercy, no pity for people who do transgress. That there's almost that you can see behind the kind of these digital mobs, behind the things people say, the efforts they make to excommunicate dissidents. You can see there's a kind of frenzied bloodlust behind it. It's only kind of, a few degrees of separation from the Chinese Cultural Revolution, from the show trials in Soviet Russia, from the Salem witch trials. I always think of the scene in Apocalypto, that kind of crazy Mel Gibson movie, in which he plays this South American member of like a South American kind of Amazonian tribe who is pursued by this mob from another tribe through the kind of primeval forest, through the rainforest. And he has to kind of use all his wits in order to survive. But the bloodlust in the mob pursuing him through the forest, they literally want to rip him limb from limb. You can see that same sentiment just beneath the surface in these mobs that come for people like you and for people like me too. And it's a horrible kind of ugly side of human nature, which we had, I think, succeeded in subduing a little bit through various laws and institutions and cultural traditions. But in those institutions where you'd expect that kind of civilizing value to be at its strongest, like the New York Times, for instance, a great liberal institution, or Princeton University, it's been eroded and is no longer really defended. And you see this kind of eruption of kind of atavistic intolerance, which I think is the natural human condition, and which these institutions have a duty to kind of keep at bay, but have been failing to do so.
What is your advice for someone who is being mobbed or being canceled? I mean, besides joining the Free Speech Union and getting some help, do you recommend them to apologize, to stand their ground? How should they conduct themselves?
Yeah, I think it's extremely hard to know what to do. I mean, I myself was targeted for cancellation successfully at the beginning of 2018. It's a long story. Anyone interested can find a kind of fairly gruesome account on Quillette. I wrote an essay about it called "The Public Humiliation Diet," because in the course of being publicly shamed, I lost about half a stone in the course of 10 days. I mean, one of the benefits of going through one of these cancellation experiences is you lose a lot of weight because it's so traumatic. I think that's something to do with the kind of fight or flight response. If you're going to have to kind of run away from the mob who are going to pursue you through the forest. Back in our kind of atavistic memory, you need to shed weight so you can run faster and move faster, be a bit more agile. So your body just naturally sheds weight when you feel like you're being targeted by a kind of angry mob, so you can run away faster. Anyway, so that happened to me. When it happened to me, I was kind of at a loss as to what to do, and where to turn to for advice. One of the kind of really traumatic things, you may have found this too, is that you feel quite isolated. People you kind of expected to come to your defense and stand beside you don't always do that. They're terrified of suddenly being targeted by the mob themselves if they place themselves between you and them. And it's not clear whether you should apologize. Will that make things better? Will it make things worse? Should I speak about this in public? Should I just kind of lie doggo and keep stum and say nothing? And one of the reasons for starting the Free Speech Union was so other people that find themselves in this position have an organization where they can seek good advice about what to do. And we have a kind of media and PR advisory council and a legal advisory council, and we actually have some psychological counselors we work with as well. So we hope, provide a kind of full spectrum service for people who do find themselves in the crosshairs in this way. And often the right response varies from, on a case by case basis. But I think it's important not to apologize and not to admit wrongdoing if you haven't done anything wrong. That doesn't ever, in my experience, placate the mob. On the contrary, as soon as they sense weakness, as soon as they see you beginning to get to your knees and prostrate yourself before them, that just increases their sense of power and also their sense of self-righteous justification for all the cruelty they're inflicting on you. They think, aha, this person's admitted that what they did was wrong, and therefore they deserve this brutal, merciless treatment I'm about to inflict on them. So it doesn't. I mean, I think generally speaking, the more you can stand up for yourself, the more robustly you can defend yourself and not resile from whatever it is you're being accused of, the more likely you are to be able to stand up to the mob. But I think that the really key thing is to try and fight back in numbers. Lots of the people who get involved in these kind of public shamings and Twitter pylons are cowards. They like to hunt in packs because they wouldn't come after you individually, and they feel this kind of. It also, if they hunt together, if they're doing these unspeakable things in concert with hundreds, in some cases thousands of other people, it doesn't prick their conscience so much. They're only one of the people sticking the knife in amongst thousands of others, so they can't really be held responsible for the kind of the death, the torture they're inflicting on the poor person at the bottom of this pylon. So if you band together with other people, if there is an organization you can turn to which will kind of stand up to the bullies in numbers, that's often very effective. So if someone starts a petition, we can start a counter petition. If someone whips up a mob on Twitter, we can see what we can do to try and get people to push back on Twitter and on Facebook. And if they try and get you fired, if they weaponize complaints procedures in companies and so forth, we have the legal expertise to push back there too. And it's been surprisingly effective. I think most people imagine that, when they're targeted for cancellation, accused of some thought crime, and when things they've said on Twitter and Facebook or elsewhere are dredged up and kind of paraded as kind of, exhibits A, B, and C as to why their soul is corrupt, they often feel completely despairing that it's the end of the world and there's really nothing they can do other than to just endure the punishment and just pray for it to end. Well, there are things you can do. You need to kind of, I often reach out to people who are in that position and tell them that there are things to do. There are people that can help them. There are ways you can go about trying to protect yourself and fight back. And the critical thing, that the kind of important first stage, is to persuade people that they aren't helpless, that there are things they can do. And when you can persuade them of that and they're willing to fight back, often they prevail in the end.
Well, Toby, thank you so much.
Thank you.